how will the tragic murder of Henry Nowak play out politically? Not a comfortable question to ask, certainly not an easy one to answer, but an issue that we're going to explore this week. And we'll also be reflecting on the latest happenings in and around the Makerfield by-election. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast. So, as ever, I'm Frank McKenna, joined by Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. And as I said in the introduction, a tragic week in many respects, particularly for the Nowak family, and the reaction from particular politicians, which I think it's fair to say can be described as absolutely despicable. Joe, I know you've got strong feelings on this. So first of all, of course, many sympathies and condolences to Henry Nowak's family. But the political reaction is what we're going to talk about this morning. So what are your reflections on the past 7 days?
One I'm sure shared by you and Jim and lots of other people, of absolute horror that, having heard Henry's father, Mark, speak so eloquently and with such dignity and calling on people to not turn it into an event that creates division. Then what happens? But Nigel Farage does his usual thing, makes an emergency statement, for goodness sake. You know, how interesting, the MP for Clacton makes an emergency statement and does what he always does, which is to take the pin out of a hand grenade and then walk away and leave that hand grenade in the hands of people like Tommy Robinson and his ilk to cause havoc, mayhem, and fuel hatred and division. And we've now seen J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth, the so-called American Secretary of War, getting involved. The whole thing has been absolutely ghastly. And then in the middle of all of this, you know, a young man has lost his life. The police have behaved appallingly by not carrying out basic first aid. There's no evidence to suggest that there was any sort of racial motive in the way that they treated Henry. They just were incompetent, and we've now got the same old chorus of two-tier policing, and everyone seems to have forgotten Stephen Lawrence and Damilola Taylor and the Macpherson report, and back before that Scarman report into the Brixton riots, and Louise Casey's report on the appalling racism and misogyny in the Met. So it's been a very unedifying week.
Yeah, it has been very distasteful, not nice to watch, and obviously the disturbances that then subsequently occurred in Southampton on the back of Nigel Farage's comments, the intervention, as you say, Joe, of Hesketh and Vance, which look even more silly this morning when we wake up to news that 6 people have been stabbed in New York's Penn Station overnight. Overnight, I guess it was in the evening there, just prior to the World Cup kicking off, of course, and a big sporting occasion in New York happening at the weekend. So for any country to be lectured by America in terms of crime rates, it seems rather bizarre. But Jim, your reaction to the Henry Nowak situation?
Well, first I must join you guys in our sympathy for the Nowak family, the incredible dignity and comprehensive nature of the statement that Henry's father made, you know, actually being aware of the potential political outcome of it, when obviously that family could be forgiven for being entirely internalized in their tragedy, was extremely impressive. On the political front, it was interesting how at Prime Minister's questions, Sir Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch were more or less on the same side and therefore it came as such a shock when Farage made his intervention. He's not comfortable in the House of Commons. He never gets the mood of the House right, and his sort of blundering around only made things worse. And as you've already hinted, Frank, just like Donald Trump and we must march on the Capitol, words coming out of leaders' mouths have consequences. And to try and say there was no connection between the cold fury and what happened on the streets of Southampton is complete nonsense. That said, if we're going to move it on a little, I still have great respect for Jack Straw, the former Home Secretary, who has said that after all the events of Stephen Lawrence, and we must remember the context for this with the police, the institutional racism that was identified, the stop and search issue, which to some extent is still there. Black people are disproportionately arrested.
4 times more likely to be stopped and searched.
Yeah. So something needed to be done, but I think we all have looked at with some care at the text of the guidance to the police, and there is a case for having another look at it and whether there has been an overcorrection. I would just try and say that in the spirit of balancing it up. But then as far as the foreign intervention is concerned, that J.D. Vance, it's so depressing to think that this guy has a good chance of becoming president of the United States, and this Trump nightmare continuing for another 8 years, a man who lacks so much judgment and no question of ignorance about the fact that this murderer was not an immigrant. He lived in this country, and wading into our affairs, just stirring it up irresponsibly, is absolutely deplorable. And it was interesting that even David Lammy, who has a personal friendship with Vance, was correcting him yesterday, and actually apparently had a conversation with him on Saturday and told him to pull in his neck.
Yeah, I think the whole thing, if you zoom back, as we have to on this podcast, because it's a political podcast, so it's the political implications of a tragic incident, and it may sound callous to people out there that we would be using as an example the murder of this young kid to talk about politics, but clearly what Nigel Farage has turned this into is a political football. And I think that we need to consider how much of an impact Farage's words are having in terms of the wider political debate. Is he tapping into something that people in the public actually believe and think? And like you, Jim, I would totally agree. He doesn't get the House of Commons, but I tell you what he does tend to get. He tends to get the mood of the British public. And so are we, as sort of liberals, looking at this situation in a way which is out of kilter with public opinion? I'm putting that out there as a question. I'm not sure what the answer actually is. I think partly Farage's reaction was to do with Restore and Rupert Lowe's march on the right of politics, and all the polls suggesting, as we discussed last week, that in the Makerfield by-election, which we'll come to later, Restore possibly gaining up to 7-8% of the vote there. So as Farage got a bit frit and thinks he needs to lean into his base a little bit more, the most depressing thing for me, actually, other than the incident itself, which again I'll comment on in a moment, was the reaction to Kemi Badenoch's statement, which she made in good faith, and I thought was a very good commentary in terms of where the situation is at this moment in time. It's when she went on to, I think it was Breakfast News on ITV, and said, I'm not interested in Black Lives Matter, I'm not interested in White Lives Matter, I'm interested in all lives. And the Reform Party took that statement totally out of context and plastered on posters and social media within hours of her saying those words, Kemi Badenoch says white lives don't matter. And that was absolutely disgraceful. And this is a dog whistle that cannot be ignored. It is the politics of the 30s. They are basically saying that the black female leader of the Conservative Party does not care about white people. Absolutely disgraceful. Jim needs calling out. And I was pleased to hear Wes Streeting in a podcast he did over the weekend, going as close as I think he possibly could to calling Farage and Reform fascists, but that's the sort of language that will just be more incendiary in terms of moving forward. But also, when you see someone like Jenrick, who worked alongside Kemi Badenoch as a cabinet member, then defending that poster campaign, where are Reform going, Jim?
Yes, well, I think you're right. I mean, they may be influenced by this, and we're going to come on to it more later on. But there is this extraordinary sub battle going on in Makerfield between Restore and Reform. They are clearly spooked, Reform, by Rupert Lowe's presence there, and apparently is having some influence on some voters there, which goes to your other point that we mustn't sit on this sort of liberal, cozy podcast and say that some of it's not having a resonance. And that's why I did say that, Jack Straw, in his wisdom, and Jack often makes helpful contributions, but not necessarily fashionable in the Labour Party. He made remarks about grooming gangs and that some Pakistani men seeing white girls as available to them when they couldn't commit their crimes on Asian girls, things like that. So you don't often hear said, but Jack made that point, and he said in connection with this, perhaps there's been an overcorrection. There needs to be a look at the guidelines, because obviously in some people's eyes, these dreadful scenes, and the fact that we've been able to see it on our television screens, it does make them think that the police now are more focused on, in some instances, dealing with racial equality than they are with actually objectively looking at a situation. But on Kemi Badenoch, just finally, she's this is a real test for her, and I think she's meeting it so far, that there really is no point in the Conservative Party chasing Reform down this right-wing and even racist route. If she's going to stand a chance of stabilising her party, and there was some evidence in the local elections that they may be bottoming out now, she's got to stand up for decent Conservative values, which have nothing to do with racism. And this is a very long-standing battle in the Conservative Party. There's a lot of talk about 1964 in an election in Smethwick in Birmingham, where
Enoch Powell.
Well, no, this was a guy called Patrick Gordon Walker who Wilson wanted.
But Enoch Powell was influenced by that campaign, wasn't he?
That's right, Powell. That's absolutely right. So this guy in Smethwick, said if you want a black neighbour, vote Labour, and beat Patrick Gordon Walker. So this has got a lot of roots going back. And then 4 years later, as you say, the infamous Powell speech. So this attempts have been made to put the Conservative Party on this path, and it's been resisted by people like Ted Heath and now by Kemi Badenoch. And I think she's got to stand firm on it, because if she goes chasing after Farage and Lowe, she will finally destroy the Conservative Party.
Yeah. I just want to add a caveat to the praise which you've thrown on Jack Straw this morning. He was, of course, terribly poor in terms of his dealing with the Hillsborough families, and obviously where I'm sat this morning, Liverpool, he's not the favoured politician of that 1997 government. I thought he was fucking awful as far as Hillsborough was concerned. So I'm not as big a fan as Jim is of Jack Straw, I'm afraid. Joe, let me turn to the Robert Jenrick remarks though, because as I say, I think for somebody who sat alongside a colleague in Kemi Badenoch, he knows exactly what Kemi Badenoch's about. He may have departed in terms of his political thinking, his policies and so on, but he knows Kemi Badenoch does care about white lives, and yet he lent into that campaign when questioned by Robert Peston about it. What a despicable character Jenrick has turned out to be.
Well, I'm not sure about turned out, Frank. I think he probably always was. And, you know, we have the favourite pub quiz question. What is the anagram of his constituency that says exactly what he is? And we'll just remind listeners that it's Newark and they can work it out for themselves. I was in the studio on GB News with Robert Jenrick, actually, and said to him, what bit of Henry's father's speech did Nigel Farage not actually understand about not turning his, and he squirmed a little bit and then smiled and said, well, what would you do? And I said, well, not that for a start. I would just echo what Jim said. I think Camille Badenoch has been really good on this. She's been very eloquent and very measured, and it may be that she has finally realised that actually Reform and Restore need to fight out their disgusting right-wing battles for themselves. But to go back to what you were saying, Frank, about this sort of dog whistle, it does resonate, because it's very easy, if you're a good communicator like Farage is, you come up with a slogan like two-tier policing and everybody latches onto it without stopping to think what it means. I mean, yes, there's two-tier policing. There's competent and incompetent in my book. But, there's two-tier policing if you happen to be a woman or you happen to be a young black man. But, people will seize on these things and nobody bothers to go in any further. And I think what we've got is such a lazy and so, pro-Farage press, particularly the Mail and the Telegraph, who are now looking at every possible equalities training or, saying, oh, millions are spent on this. And then you work it out, it was £140 over 6 years or something like that for 15 police officers. And it's also worth reminding everybody that Hampshire Police were in fact called out by an undercover, a whistleblower actually, who'd recorded quite a lot of material while they were working for Hampshire Police. And so they were taken to task for their racism and rightly called out. And as a result, they had to institute this sort of equality training. I mean, it is horrifying and deeply saddening that we're going backwards, and we're going backwards in a way that means people go, I'm probably not allowed to say that. And everybody goes, and actually it's not about whether you're allowed to, and it's not about free speech. It's about common sense, for Christ's sake. But I think the way Keir Starmer dealt with Farage, Prime Minister's question, was absolutely brilliant. He was cold, he was icy, and he'd got cold fury, cold rage. And I think both Kemi Badenoch and Ed Davey, did exactly the same. They were right. And I wonder whether there is a point that when you see Farage, obviously he's not very good in the Commons. He's not there often enough to get the practice, Jim. That's why. But, you see him doing that and then popping off to some private members club for lunch. You then see the Yobs led by Tommy Robinson and his ilk on the streets of Southampton. And I don't think it takes too much for people to put those two things together. We just need to make sure they are doing it more and saying this comment leads to this behaviour. And he didn't condemn the violence. He could have said, you can be angry, you can be furious, you can protest, but I absolutely condemn the violence. 11 police officers and a police dog. Ridiculous.
He's basically trying to, as I say, tap into that base, isn't he? What we've got to watch for is to how big that base actually is, because it's very much a Trumpian approach to a situation. And we saw what happened in the States. We'd hope that the UK is not on that page, but there are people, as was proved by those riots in Southampton, who absolutely are on that page and do believe that there is two-tier policing against white people. So there is an argument to be won, but I agree with you, Joe. The more that the traditional mainstream parties can speak with one voice on issues such as this, the more isolated Reform and Restore look. So let's hope that continues on this issue and others that are likely to be as controversial moving forward. Last word on this from me in terms of the incident itself, and there's an inquiry going on, so we don't know what the outcome of that inquiry is going to be. And again, isn't it sad that we've jumped to certain conclusions? The body cam has been released. I couldn't watch that, I have to confess. Just too hard for me to watch something as horrible, as awful as that. But I would just suggest that we may find that the officers who attended the incident were not particularly experienced. I may also suggest that, from what I'm told by people who are in the medical profession that I've spoken to over the weekend, the injuries that poor Henry sustained were more likely to have resulted in internal bleeding rather than external bleeding. So unless you were very, very well qualified in medical terms, you would not necessarily have thought that he'd been stabbed. None of this is to excuse that awful situation, but I think we ought to await the final inquiry before we all start to jump on bandwagons. And let's not forget, we talked about J.D. Vance and Peter Hesketh. The reaction and response from Elon Musk was even more awful and horrifying. They basically took to X and started and Grok, I think it was, and identified 2 police officers who had absolutely nothing to do with the incident, plastered it all over those social media platforms. One of them now has had to go into hiding. A police officer who had actually been in number 10 to receive a commendation award for bravery, he's now had to go into hiding. And a poor woman, again, who retired, I think, from the police force 2 years ago, whose family have faced death threats. This is the sort of ridiculous and horrible world that we are starting to see on the back of social media. And I'm pleased to see that the government have taken some steps, not bold enough in my opinion, but some steps over the last week or so, and some breaking news this morning that social media companies are going to have their wings clipped somewhat. I think more needs to be done because it is getting totally out of hand. What's going to happen next? Some poor person who's misidentified going to end up killed, assassinated, murdered because of this fake news that Elon Musk and co tell us they're totally against. So absolutely despicable, as I say.
Well, and there are 100 MPs now suing Musk and Grok for the fake sexualized photo. 100 MPs.
But the thing is, Joe, this guy is about to become a trillionaire.
I know, but you know, the question is,
you can sue him as much as you like.
Of course, and he's not going to give a damn if Keir Starmer says, oh, you know, I'm going to give you a warning, and if you don't do this will happen. He couldn't care less. Actually, the government and the BBC and everybody sensible need to stop using X. And the other thing that people need to know is that people like Rupert Lowe and Tommy Robinson and all of those sort of people, they get paid for their posts. So actually, it's a very nice little earner. This is not just somebody going, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to press that button and send out something racist and horrible. Actually, the more extreme you are, the more likes you get or whatever they are, and therefore you get more money. So does Elon Musk. And I would say to the government, I tell you what, let's just have a complete ban. There are other alternatives, and there are quite a lot of people, myself included, who exist perfectly well without being on any social media.
Well, I came off X, must have been at least 12 months ago now, I think. Can't say I'm missing it. But again, I'll just reference back to that Wes Streeting podcast. And he was saying, you know, where there is extremism and right-wing propaganda, you've got to be in that space pushing back against it. I think the problem is, such is the control of the algorithm now, that you're trying to push water uphill. So I agree with you, Joe. I think we've got to say the government have got to come off it, and we've got to be saying to our journalists, stop quoting people who are on X or, you know, even Truth Social. Donald Trump put something out there when he's obviously, you know, in some state of mental challenge, and all of a sudden it's making bloody headlines on the news the next day.
Just on the money thing, I mean, just the final link, of course, is that when they get the clicks, the advertising comes. I mean, that's the final link in this. So, you know, the companies who are advertising on this have got questions to answer.
That's a great point, Jim. It's a great point. And a good one to end the first part of this week's podcast on. But as I said at the outset, our thoughts, our prayers with Henry Nowak and his family, and whatever the political consequences of that tragedy, that family will have to live with that awful situation for the rest of their lives. So, as I say, our thoughts are with them. Right, stay with us. After the break, we'll be talking about the Makerfield by-election, question time, and how Andy Burnham might get around the challenge I set last week, suggesting that him going for the Labour leadership may be more complex than people think. Stick with us. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. As ever, me, Frank McKenna, joined by Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock, and it's been another interesting week in Makerfield. I, would you believe, guys, was knocking on doors in Lee this week to gauge the temperature of look at.
Well, Lee's not in the constituency.
Oh well, there you go, James. You see, you're not as up to date as you are on your history, but your modern politics, are you? the old Lee constituency has been part of it, merged with Makerfield, and so it's what I would consider to be Lee.
But not the town of Lee. Okay.
So no, but it's Lee. And the people who live there were Lee people, and would happily say that. So I was knocking on doors in Lee. Shut up, James, and stop pulling faces. And it was, I think it's fair to say, mixed reaction. I think it was in a couple of streets, a neighbourhood that was not particularly favourable to Andy Burnham, but there were some supporters there. In fact, those that were supporting Andy Burnham seemed to be far more enthusiastic than those who were sort of gruffly saying, no, we're not interested. So an interesting evening of door knocking, and that was on the Thursday. And of course, on the Thursday evening, we had this, I found, rather surreal question time debate between all the candidates, where you really only had one politician on the panel, which was Andy Burnham. And then you have these other people who clearly, some of them just delighted to be on the telly. To be fair to the Green candidate came across okay, I thought made some good points. But the guy from Reform, this character that they've selected because they think everybody in the North likes to vote for plumbers in by-elections. What's his name? Remind me.
Rob Kenyon.
Wow. I mean, somebody said to me at our awards dinner on Friday in Cheshire, and by the way, congratulations to all the winners of the Cheshire and North Wales Business Awards on Friday. Fabulous day that was. They said to me, I felt sorry and embarrassed for the guy. I said, well, I never feel sorry for anybody who's a misogynist racist, but even I was having to watch the television through my fingers as he was trying to respond to some of the questions that were put to him. As far as Mr. Burnham was concerned, I thought he was nervous to start with. I think you could tell he was the only one on the panel who had anything to lose, and was clearly sort of built himself into, got himself into his rhythm, and by the end of it was the professional politician that you come to expect from Andy Burnham. But the guy from Reform, Jim, bloody hell, he looked totally out of his depth. And the depressing thing for me wasn't the fact that this guy is as thick as mince and shouldn't be anywhere near a ballot paper to be elected as a representative for a parish council, never mind to Parliament. But there were people in the audience who were applauding the nonsense that he was coming out with, and their body language told you that they supported this character. Totally depressing, as I say. Not the fact that this guy is not fit for office, but the fact there were a good proportion of that question time audience who are clearly going to go out in a couple of weeks' time and vote for the prick.
Well, that encapsulates the choice that the people of Makerfield have got, really. It's a shame. I don't agree with you completely. I think the Conservative candidate, I think he's called Wyn Stanley. He's a former mayor of Wigan, and from his own perspective, I thought
okay. Actually,
he did okay.
Yeah, you're correct. Yeah,
but he's not at the races, and it really is between Kenyon and Burnham. And you are right to reflect. I mean, there's a great danger of us sitting here and being overly critical of Kenyon. Clearly,
Jim, can I just interrupt there? Because I think this is one of the problems. When you see someone who is as thick as mince, you have to say they are as thick as mince. You can't wrap this up. The guy would not have got away with the sort of performance he put in on Thursday at my sixth form college at John Rigby in a debate. I'd have torn him apart. As an 18-year-old lad, I would have been able to tear that guy apart. He should not be anywhere near a ballot paper, Jim. And unless we're prepared to, you see, this is the problem with us. We're too polite. Can you imagine Labour putting a candidate up like that and Farage sitting back and go, oh, well, you've got to understand and appreciate, working class people are all a bit thick. No, working class people, myself included, people may not agree with me, people might not like me, but I hope people wouldn't say he's absolutely thick and hasn't got a clue what he's talking about. That guy is so out of his depth that it is unbelievable, Jim, and we've got to say it. Let's not be all fucking mollycoddled and, oh, no, you can't say that. He might upset a few people. He's as thick as mince. I'll say it again.
Nevertheless, there remains the possibility that he will defeat the potential next prime minister of this country. I don't know how the Nowak situation is going to affect it, but some people I've been speaking to said that what happened last week, the events in Southampton, the sort of support that Farage has for his cold fury, could actually boost the guy. But anyway, the point is that people have a stark choice. That notwithstanding, I don't disagree with you about the criticisms of Kenyon. It's just my anxiety is that it'll come over to some of the people that were clapping in the audience for him will say, oh, there's McKenna and Hancock and Phillips, they are a particular class and they've got a particular view about it. And even though they're right about the analysis of his intellectual capacity, nevertheless, and this is the key point, he stands for change. He stands for a tough stance on immigration. And by the way, he actually, knows us in that sense, and he will be the MP. From our reckoning, he won't do a good job.
The guy didn't stand for anything. He basically said to almost every question, "Well, that's what I said then, but I don't believe that now. What do you believe? I don't know." Yes, that was his answer to every single question. So he doesn't stand for change, does he? He's standing because he got approached as a plumber to stand in this by-election on the basis that, well, you're from Ashton, you've made some sexist and racist comments, so you'll do for us. He's then tried to backtrack on everything that he said in those historical social media posts. And when he was asked questions such as, okay, what would you do about policing? Here's one example. We're going to recruit 30,000 police, was his answer to one of the questions. Fiona Bruce says to him, or somebody from the audience actually, because Fiona Bruce wouldn't challenge him that harshly. How would you pay for those 30,000 police officers in terms of recruitment? And where would you get them from? That's not my problem. Fucking hell. Come on, Jim.
But we are in an age, I'm just saying, we are in an age where it's what I keep on saying, the Donald Trump, I could go out in the street and shoot someone and they'd still vote for me. that is where he's going to get his support from. People will not care about that. They are just so exasperated and depressed that they will vote for him. And then, so that's the choice on that side. And then you've got Andy Burnham, who I thought, really showed himself off as the local candidate, having represented the previous seat. He was very articulate about all the local issues as well. But he obviously has to overcome this thing, which we're hearing on Vox Pops from people saying he wants to get to Westminster and we won't see him for dust. But he is personable. He clearly, is from the area. He can match Kenyon really in terms of local authenticity, and is clearly massively more competent than Kenyon. But I just make the point that we're living in such an age now where Kenyon will have his supporters who will completely ignore his intellectual inadequacy, completely ignore his highly awful posting in the past, and vote for him. So the deal's not. I think Andy will win, probably reasonably comfortably, but I'm not certain of it, because there is that mentality in the electorate now. We were talking about it in connection with the previous subject, where they don't care and they're just going to make a protest, and that's what Andy would need to worry about.
But you see, let me just make my point clear so that we're not confused by my assessment of this character and people who either vote Reform or other people who are councillors perhaps, or indeed members of Parliament. I wouldn't describe Robert Jenrick as thick as mince. I think Robert Jenrick can be many other things, but I wouldn't describe him as being thick. Lee Anderson, I wouldn't describe as being thick. There are many other people who I disagree with politically, who are to the right of me and to the right of the Conservative Party, who I don't consider to be thick. That guy is thick. And I think when you see somebody who is that daft, then it is incumbent upon you to say, this is just not safe. I would be saying that this is an insult to the people of Makerfield, that you have put somebody like that up for selection when you could have had somebody who at least could string a sentence together on a programme such as Question Time and answer one or two questions. Every interview he's done has been an absolute car crash, and every time he comes to a conclusion, it's, well, I'm not too sure about that, I'll have to look into it. So I've got no problem calling the lad thick as mince, because he is. It's not an insult to the electors or people who vote for Reform. Not saying they're all stupid, but I would suggest to anybody who has watched that Question Time programme that if you are still going to go to the polls in a couple of weeks' time and vote for that guy, then you deserve what you get. That's all I'd say. Joe,
I agree with you, Frank. I completely agree with you. I had to laugh that the Daily Express said it was awful. Rob Kenyon was thrown into the lion's den. Hello, that's what happens when you stand for election. And if you can't hack it, then you shouldn't be doing it, whether that's at parish council, city council, or going for an MP. I think there's a danger, and I think Jim sort of alluded to it, but that people feel sorry for him and they believe the shtick that he's an ordinary guy. He just says it how it is. He might make some mistakes, but he's one of us. But it seems bizarre that Reform have gone from the pseudo-intellectual, complete social monster that is Matt Goodwin to this bloke who might be fine at fixing your U-bend or unblocking your drain, but clearly wouldn't be able to find his way to Westminster, because I doubt if he can read a map.
Yeah, I just think, whether he could even do that. There's people, I don't know whether this is true or not, so better just say the caveat is there are posts on social media that I saw over the weekend suggesting that the guy only set up his plumbing company in February. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not. It doesn't mean he's not a plumber, of course. He might have just set his own business up recently. He's been doing plumbing for years. But let me just turn to the broader issue, because, as I say, I can't take this Kenyon guy seriously. Sadly, Jim's right. He still might win. I said last week that it was going to be very complex for Andy Burnham if he got into Parliament in terms of simply launching a leadership campaign, and that might be a barrier for him. The longer you go from being elected as an MP, and then my scenario was he gets offered a position in the cabinet and and so on and so forth, and it drags it on and on and on to the point where Keir Starmer continues as PM. Again, it's been suggested to me that one of the scenarios might be he wins on the 16th of June, isn't it? The election, I think. 18th of June. And in his acceptance speech, he announces that he's going to challenge Keir Starmer the following week. Well, what do you think, Jim?
Well, the textual analysis of what he actually said on the programme, and he had to do it. It was very interesting, wasn't it? Because Andy's wanted to be a bit sort of coy about all that. But this woman sort of said, I'm a big fan of Question Time, but nobody ever answers the question. And she said, come on, Andy. And it was in response to that late. And there were one or two women in the audience, by the way, who were excellent. There was another woman who was really excoriating about Keir Starmer. You often get these people,
there was another woman who said, I'd rather vote for a career politician than a sexist woman.
That's right.
I thought she was excellent.
They were all in the tradition of that Bristol woman who said, oh, not another one, and the woman in Rochdale who skewered Gordon Brown, and somebody in Birmingham who on cancer embarrassed Tony Blair. They cannot, when it's the public, they cannot go into the routine that they do with professional interviewers. But just on the textual thing, he said he would join. He said apparently Wes Streeting has already launched a leadership campaign, and if that's the case, I would join it. I just want to make this rather nerdy point that in a sense it puts it down to Wes Streeting to move first. That I think Burnham's just given himself that tiny margin. Rather than doing what you said on the 19th of June, he declares it. So that I just leave that he'll want it to be said that I just wanted to get to Westminster and see and look out the land, and settle down as the MP for Makerfield. But Wes has declared, therefore I have to enter the race. I just leave that as a tiny possibility.
Well, Wes sort of responded to that very positively and said, well, I've often been the person who's had to lead the Labour Party to do uncomfortable things, and if that's going to be the case this time, then so be it. And that's where Andy needs to be a little bit careful.
But do you think that's what will happen?
Clever by half.
But do you think that's what will happen? That Wes will say, I find it a bit difficult for Andy wins with a huge, massive amount of publicity. What does Wes make the first move? I don't know.
Well, it's hard, isn't it? But as I say, I could well see the scenario where we end up with this bizarre situation of Keir Starmer staying in office for.
As far as we can tell, he is going to be in the race. As far as we can tell,
because he, unless somebody does trigger the leadership contest, then he stays anyway. And he's already saying that if there is a contest, he'll run. I mean, just let me turn to this, Joe, because as I say, Andy Burnham obviously getting an awful lot of headlines and exposure at the moment because he is running in this high-profile by-election. I think people do see this as a huge test, not just for Andy, but for Labour. Because
and for reform, actually.
Yeah, but he's he's Labour's most popular and retail politician, Andy Burnham. So if Labour were to lose this seat, I think it would be an absolute disaster. So, as I say, he's getting a lot of column inches, but this long-form podcast that Wes Streeting did with Lewis Goddard on the Newsagents podcast, Streeting made, it's one of the most open discussions that you will hear with a modern day politician. So honest. But basically Streeting's challenge to Starmer was, well, that's fine if you're going to stand, that's okay, but you've got to give your cabinet members the opportunity of nominating somebody else. His contention is that at least half of the cabinet now don't think Keir Starmer is up for being Prime Minister. So the gauntlet is getting thrown down by Wes Streeting to Keir Starmer for sure. And I think Wes is positioning himself quite well. Not necessarily, he's already saying, look, I know I'm the underdog. Andy Burnham's going to be favourite to win. But he is saying, rightly, I think, that the Labour Party needs to have a discussion about ideas, not just about personality. Yes. And that's where Streeting could actually come into his own in any leadership contest.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because I think, even if Andy Burnham were to win, and even if he were then to win a leadership contest against Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting and who knows who else might stand, he would probably have about 6 weeks of a bounce where people would expect him to work miracles. And unless he's got ideas and clear strategy of how to put those ideas into action, and has said absolutely to the PLP, the Labour Party, the Parliamentary Labour Party, we've got to make really tough decisions. You've got to back us, because if you don't, the other lot will do it and it'll be 10 times worse. But, I don't think he's going to necessarily be the answer to Labour's problems. And I think in a way it goes back to what we discussed last week. And, whilst we may have differing views on the value or not of Tony Blair's intervention, the point was, you've got to be really clear about what you want to do. And in a way, Frank, we've seen it this morning. It's social media, children, bans, blah. And what do we get? We get Keir Starmer, coming up with a warning to the tech companies that we've just talked about that are worth trillions, who couldn't give a flying monkeys about being threatened with fines. You've got Ofcom that is pathetic. And you sort of think, oh, is that it? And the big issue, the elephant in the room, is bloody defence spending and welfare. And neither of those things have been dealt with, never mind social care, which is just under the carpet again. So I think, I wish Andy Burnham well. He might not want to be leader, actually. He might want to go in and be an MP and be part of a cabinet. But, why did Keir Starmer not put him in the Lords, as I think you suggested, when they won the election, put him on the cabinet, at the cabinet table with responsibility for devolution? He would have neutralised the threat to his leadership, and he'd have had a really effective communicator from the cabinet who talked to the country.
While we were
the reason he didn't do that was because, as again, Wes Streeting very ably points out in that podcast, Keir Starmer's not a politician, Jim.
No, exactly.
Well, just a brief one while we're on the pylon on Starmer, and I have frequently defended him on this podcast, but one hears a whisper, this wretched delay on the defence expenditure. One understands he's going to sort of slice most of the departments, but an extra slice off for the Department of Transport.
Yeah.
If the Northern Powerhouse Rail is once again sacrificed because of the I won't be able to come on the podcast for the obscenity of my language. I mean, it is unbelievable that infrastructure is going to be once again targeted to pay for it. And not a mention of welfare.
Not having the gumption to stop HS2.
Yeah.
The whole thing's ridiculous. And it's a real shame. But one of the things that really struck me over the weekend in one of the papers is that Keir Starmer did not meet with Alan Milburn before commissioning him to do the report on youth unemployment. Now, we know that apparently he didn't meet with Peter Mandelson before he appointed him. But if you go, wouldn't you say, oh, Frank, you're going to ask Jim to do something. Jim, pop into the office, or let's meet for a pint or something. We'll have a chat. No, you do it all by what? By remote control. It's almost as though he's got a phobia about meeting people.
No, it's just, whatever happens, right? Keir Starmer needs to go. That's my sort of conclusion to this. And we have been, we have defended him for near 2 years now. But the more I hear from people who've worked inside Number 10, and then if you listen to that interview, as I say, with Wes Streeting, it's painful listening, actually. And at the end of it, of course, everyone says, look, Keir Starmer's a good guy. He's not a bad man, and the hatred of him out in the country is hard to understand, because he's not the worst Prime Minister we've had in
But
recent
people
times.
do hate him. They
But
hate
people
him
hate him.
with
Yeah.
real vitriol,
It's-
in a way that
Yeah.
only I hated Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
But
It's bizarre though, isn't it? I
weird
think,
for
because
somebody
I don't
who's
think,
so anodyne.
yeah, because that's the point, isn't it? You know, with Johnson, you could say, well, people either loved him or hated him. But with somebody like Keir Starmer, you just think, nah, really. Anyway, listen, we've got to go shortly because Jim's been summoned by his missus to get out of the den by 10:30 at the latest. Apparently, it's got to do something to do with his attractive legs, but we'll go into that another time. The downtown team have been busy last week. I did mention that we were having Andy Street to Liverpool with his new organisation Prosper, and Andy came along and spoke to about 30 business leaders from the professional services and creative sectors in Liverpool. Spoke very well, I have to say, in terms of where the UK is at the moment in its economic situation, also some of the solutions that he, Ruth Davidson and others within the Prosper UK team are hoping to come up with in time for the Conservative Party conference in October. No appetite at all, I'm afraid, Jim, from Andy or any of his colleagues to link up with the Liberal Democrats. In fact, I thought he was going to be sick when I suggested that. But I only jest. He sort of, he dismissed that as being rather fanciful. But not massively anti voting reform. So there you go. So on a positive note, sort of saying, voting reform maybe. And of course, he, as mayor of the West Midlands, was elected twice on, I think, single transferable vote. So maybe that informs his thinking somewhat. And then, as I say, we bounced on to Friday, Chester Racecourse, Cheshire and North Wales Business Awards. Many congratulations to all of the winners on the day. In particular, just pick out a couple of them. Karen Farrell, who won the Chief Executive's Award from Crime Prevention Services, Trudy Burrows, who won the Chair's Award, and Rick Parry, a speaker at a number of downtown events in recent years. He's currently the Chief Executive of the Football League, won Man of the Year, and was suitably pleased walking off with that gong. We're in Parliament this week for the Liverpool City Region Parliamentary Reception. So hopefully Joe, Jim and myself will see you on the terrace for a glass of something sparkling. It's been great to have a chat with you as always. Thank you for listening and enjoy the next 7 days. We will be back with our reflections on that parliamentary reception and, of course, looking ahead to the fateful day of the Makerfield by-election.